Imagine sitting quietly at your own sister's wedding while your mother grabs the microphone, smiles at 200 guests, and turns you into the evening's cruelest joke. She tells everyone to pray for you because no one wants you, and the ballroom erupts with laughter. Some people look away in embarrassment, others join in, believing they are witnessing harmless family humor. But what none of them know is that the woman they are laughing at has been hiding a life so extraordinary that it is about to shatter every assumption in that room. Instead of crying, begging, or running away, one calm sentence changes everything. "Mom, he's already here." Seconds later, the ballroom doors open, and the person who walks inside freezes every smile, silences every whisper, and turns public humiliation into a moment no one will ever forget. This is not simply a story about revenge. It is a story about betrayal that lasted for decades, about the invisible wounds caused by a parent who never saw her own child, and about the incredible power of knowing your worth when everyone else has underestimated you. Stay with me until the very end, because every painful moment leads to a breathtaking payoff, every insult has a consequence, and the final scene will leave you with the kind of emotional justice that makes this journey impossible to forget. My name is Lauren Mitchell. I am 40 years old, and I have spent my entire career building complex operations for one of the largest consulting firms in America. To most people who know me professionally, I am calm under pressure, dependable, and impossible to intimidate. To my own family, however, I have always been something much smaller, a quiet woman who never quite measured up to the sister everyone adored. Looking back now, I realize the story that exploded inside that ballroom did not begin at my sister's wedding. It began decades earlier, inside a house that looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. I grew up in Naperville, Illinois, in a neighborhood where every lawn was trimmed, every porch carried flower pots in spring, and everyone believed they knew their neighbors. Our white two-story house, with blue shutters, fit in so perfectly that strangers would have called us the ideal American family. My mother, Diane Mitchell, helped make sure of that. She had spent more than 20 years teaching kindergarten, and half the town adored her. Parents praised her patience. Children ran into her arms at grocery stores years after leaving her classroom. She baked cookies for school fundraisers, remembered birthdays without checking a calendar, and somehow convinced everyone she met that kindness was simply part of who she was. I used to wonder if I had imagined the woman I lived with every day, because the version everyone else knew felt like an entirely different person. At home, she never screamed. She never threw dishes or slammed doors. That would have been too obvious. Her talent was much quieter than that. She knew exactly how to make one daughter feel treasured while making the other slowly disappear. My younger sister, Chloe, was the center of every celebration. Her artwork covered the refrigerator. Every ballet recital became a family event. My mother sat proudly in the front row with a camcorder, capturing every spin and every smile, as though the performance belonged on national television. Whenever guests visited, Chloe was introduced with glowing pride. "This is my beautiful baby girl," my mother would say, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. Then she would glance toward me. "And this is Lauren." Nothing more. No compliment. No story. Just my name, hanging awkwardly in the air before the conversation moved back to Chloe. It sounds like such a small thing now, but childhood is built from thousands of tiny moments. Eventually, those moments become the voice inside your own head. My father noticed what was happening long before I did. Frank Mitchell worked as an insurance adjuster, a man who spent his days studying damaged things and trying to make people whole again. He wasn't loud or confrontational. He never challenged my mother directly because conflict wasn't in his nature. Instead, he quietly balanced the scales wherever he could. He drove me to every science fair. He attended every academic competition. When my mother skipped another event because Chloe had dance practice, Dad showed up carrying a thermos of coffee and the same gentle smile that somehow made empty auditoriums feel less lonely. My favorite memories of him were the notes he slipped into my lunchbox. They never said, "Have a great day," or "Love you." Instead, they contained fascinating little facts. Did you know octopuses have 3 hearts? The human brain uses 20% of the body's energy. Honey never spoils. Every note reminded me that curiosity mattered, that learning mattered, that I mattered. I saved every one of them. Then came the afternoon that quietly changed my life. I was 14 years old when academic decathlon practice was canceled unexpectedly. I came home earlier than usual, carrying my report card inside my backpack. Every grade was an A. I remember thinking that maybe this time would be different. Maybe if Mom saw the report card before Chloe came home, she would smile the way other mothers smiled. Maybe she would hug me. Maybe she would simply say she was proud. I never got the chance. As I walked through the hallway toward the front porch, I heard voices outside. My mother was sitting with our neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, sharing iced tea in the expensive glasses she only used when she wanted to impress someone. I froze when I heard my name. "Chloe is my pretty one," my mother said with an affectionate laugh. "She'll have boys lining up around the block one day." The neighbor murmured something I couldn't hear. Then my mother laughed again, softer this time. "Lauren? Well, at least she's smart. But smart doesn't get you a husband, does it? Smart doesn't keep a man warm at night." Both women laughed together. Their glasses clinked gently in the afternoon sunlight. I stood in the hallway gripping the strap of my backpack so tightly my fingers hurt. Inside that backpack was proof that I had worked harder than almost anyone my age. Yet suddenly, those straight A's felt meaningless. I walked upstairs without making a sound. I pinned the report card to the corkboard above my desk, where only I would ever see it, and I made myself a promise that afternoon. I would never again bring my accomplishments home, expecting love in return. Looking back, that wasn't the moment my heart broke. It was the moment it learned how to hide. My mother never noticed the change. Why would she? You cannot miss something you never truly saw. My father noticed almost immediately, though he waited years before mentioning it. One evening, while driving me home after one of our weekly dinners together, he kept his eyes on the road and quietly said, "Lauren, you don't have to earn your place in this family. You already have one." I smiled and told him I understood. The truth was, I didn't. Deep down, I had already started believing that love was something you had to qualify for, and no matter how hard I worked, I would always finish second. Little did I know, the years ahead would give me every opportunity to prove my worth to the world, while convincing myself that the one place I could never belong was the place I had once called home. That promise carried me into the first chapter of my professional life with far more determination than confidence. I joined Archer and Weston straight out of college because it was the biggest challenge I could find. The firm had a reputation for expecting the impossible from young consultants, and I wanted to know whether I could survive in a place where results mattered more than appearances. During my first week, I realized I had underestimated just how demanding the environment would be. Days routinely stretched well into the night. Weekends disappeared without warning. Every assignment felt like an examination you could fail with a single careless decision. Some people left within months because they couldn't handle the pressure. I stayed because, for the first time, I was living in a world where hard work actually changed the outcome. I discovered that I loved solving complicated problems. While others focused on presentations or office politics, I became fascinated by the hidden systems behind successful companies. I enjoyed finding the one inefficient process costing millions of dollars or the overlooked detail preventing an entire operation from improving. It felt almost like solving giant puzzles, except the solutions affected thousands of employees and billions of dollars. The promotions came steadily, though never easily. Each new responsibility demanded more from me than the previous one. I learned how to negotiate with executives twice my age without raising my voice. I learned that listening carefully often revealed more than speaking confidently. Most importantly, I learned that trust is earned one decision at a time. By the time I turned 30, I had already managed projects across multiple countries. I spent more nights in airports than I cared to count, and became so familiar with hotel rooms that they often felt more comfortable than my own apartment. I wasn't chasing titles. I was chasing excellence because excellence was the only language I completely trusted. One assignment changed everything. Our Southeast Asia operations were struggling through an enormous supply chain crisis. Several competitors had already withdrawn from the region, convinced the losses couldn't be reversed. Senior leadership expected damage control. Instead, I proposed rebuilding the entire operational structure. Many people believed the plan was too ambitious. A few quietly expected me to fail. 18 exhausting months later, our division had not only recovered but expanded beyond every projection. Revenue increased dramatically, clients returned, and Archer and Weston strengthened its position while other firms continued retreating. After presenting the final results to senior leadership, I walked back to my office expecting another ordinary workday. Instead, someone knocked on my door. It was the company's new chief executive officer, David Harrington. He had taken over only months earlier, yet everyone already respected him for one simple reason. He noticed people that others overlooked. He stepped inside, closed the door, and asked if I had a few minutes. I assumed he wanted clarification about one of the reports. Instead, he sat across from me and smiled. "You've done remarkable work." I thanked him politely. He looked directly at me. "No," he said. "I don't think you understand. You've solved problems that experienced executives believed were impossible. That isn't ordinary talent." Nobody in my family had ever spoken to me that way. I wasn't sure how to respond. David continued asking questions about my leadership style, my long-term goals, and the kind of organization I wanted to build if given greater authority. He listened carefully instead of waiting for his turn to speak. When our conversation ended, he stood, shook my hand, and said something that stayed with me for years. "I hope you aren't planning to stay exactly where you are." Within 12 months, I had been promoted again. My responsibilities expanded from one region to 12 countries. Thousands of employees now depended on decisions made inside my office every single day. The work was exhilarating, demanding, and deeply meaningful. Ironically, the more successful I became, the less my family knew about my life. Whenever relatives asked how work was going, I answered with simple phrases. "It's busy. Things are going well. I've been traveling." Those statements were true. They simply omitted almost everything. I drove a modest Honda, even though I could easily afford something far more expensive. I lived comfortably without displaying wealth. I rarely discussed bonuses, promotions, or industry recognition, because experience had taught me exactly how those conversations usually ended. Unfortunately, that lesson repeated itself every time I forgot. After one promotion, I mentioned becoming a director during a family dinner. Mom smiled politely before saying, "That's nice, but success doesn't make an empty house feel less lonely." The conversation immediately shifted back to Chloe. Another year, after buying my condominium in Chicago, I proudly showed a few photographs during Christmas. Mom studied them for only a moment. "A beautiful place for one person," she said. "I suppose that's still better than renting." Everyone laughed lightly. I quietly put my phone away. The home I had worked years to purchase somehow became another reminder that I wasn't living the life she believed I should want. The final time I tried sharing good news happened after receiving a national leadership award within my industry. I brought the crystal plaque home during Christmas, thinking perhaps this achievement would be different. It wasn't. The plaque never left its protective case. Mom spent the entire evening discussing wedding magazines Chloe had started collecting, even though she wasn't engaged yet. By the time dessert arrived, I carried the award back to my car, unopened. Driving home that night through falling snow, I realized something important. I wasn't protecting myself by hiding my accomplishments anymore. I was protecting the version of my mother that still existed in my imagination. Some part of me kept hoping she would eventually become the parent I had needed as a little girl. Every promotion I mentioned, every achievement I shared, every milestone I revealed, each one was another quiet request to finally be seen. Each one received the same answer. Gradually, I stopped asking. David noticed the pattern long before anyone else. One afternoon after a board meeting, he invited me into his office. Other executives often brought spouses, siblings, or parents to company celebrations. I always attended alone. He leaned back in his chair. I've been meaning to ask you something. Of course. Why have I never met anyone from your family? I answered automatically. They're just not interested in corporate events. He studied me for several seconds without speaking. Then he said something I wasn't prepared to hear. I don't think they're uninterested. I looked at him. I think you've spent years making sure those worlds never meet. The room became very quiet. He wasn't criticizing me. He sounded genuinely concerned. I looked out the window, toward the Chicago skyline, while considering how to answer. Finally, I smiled. It's easier this way. David nodded slowly, though I could tell he didn't believe me. Sometimes the most difficult lies are the ones we tell ourselves. At work, I had become a woman, trusted with extraordinary responsibility. At home, I continued playing the role everyone expected, saying little, revealing less, and pretending that none of it mattered. I convinced myself I had found the perfect balance. I had no idea that balance was about to disappear the moment my sister announced she was getting married. My sister's engagement became the first major family event in years that required all of us to spend significant time together. Ryan proposed on a warm Saturday afternoon in Millennium Park, right beside the famous mirrored sculpture that tourists crowded around every day. Before either family received a phone call, Chloe had already posted photographs online. By evening, hundreds of people had congratulated her. My mother proudly announced that she had always known Chloe would have a fairy tale romance. Listening to her, you would have thought she had personally arranged the proposal. Within days, the wedding stopped feeling like Chloe and Ryan's celebration and started becoming my mother's greatest production. She researched venues, interviewed florists, debated linen colors, and discussed seating charts as though she had been appointed director of an elaborate stage performance. Ryan's parents handled most of the expenses with remarkable generosity, yet Mom behaved as if every decision belonged exclusively to her. I stayed mostly in the background. That wasn't difficult because no one expected anything else. One evening, I invited Chloe to dinner after work. She looked exhausted beneath the excitement, buried under binders full of vendor contracts and sample invitations. "You doing okay?" I asked. She smiled weakly. I didn't know planning one day could become a full-time job. I believe it. She laughed. Mom has opinions about everything. I reached into my purse and quietly slid an envelope across the table. She looked confused before opening it. Inside was a check for $15,000. Her eyes widened. "Lauren, I can't take this." "Yes, you can. It's too much." "No," I said gently. "It's a wedding. Nothing about weddings is inexpensive." She looked down at the check again. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Use it for whatever makes the day easier." For a brief moment, she looked as though she might cry. Then she folded the check carefully and slipped it into her purse. "Please don't tell Mom." I smiled. I wasn't planning to. She nodded with obvious relief. "She'll somehow make it complicated." That sentence lingered in my thoughts during the drive home. Even Chloe understood our mother's ability to transform generosity into something uncomfortable. Weeks passed. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Chloe. "Mom's draft seating chart. Thoughts?" I opened the attachment while waiting for an elevator after a board meeting. My eyes immediately searched for my name. Table 9. I studied the floor plan. The ballroom was enormous. Table 9 sat near the service entrance where waiters would constantly move in and out carrying trays and dirty dishes. Around it were distant relatives, acquaintances, and guests included more out of obligation than closeness. It wasn't an accident. I called Chloe before the elevator doors opened. She answered almost immediately. "You saw it." I did. A long silence followed. Finally, I asked, "Table 9? Her voice became careful. Mom thought it made the most sense. "For whom?" "The head tables are mostly couples." "I understand that." "Lauren." "No," I interrupted softly. "I'm genuinely asking." She sighed. She said, "Since you're coming alone." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. I already knew the rest. Single people belonged at the edges. Visible enough to satisfy etiquette. invisible enough not to distract from the story being told. "It's fine," I said. "It isn't personal." I almost smiled. Everything about my place in that family had always been personal. "I'll be there. You could invite someone. A friend. A coworker. Anyone." I thanked her for the suggestion and ended the conversation before either of us had to pretend the idea was realistic. The truth was painfully simple. I could have invited almost anyone from work. Senior executives, close colleagues, friends who had become family over the years. Every one of them would have accepted. But inviting someone into that environment meant exposing two completely different versions of my life. At Archer and Weston, I was trusted, respected, and heard. At family gatherings, I became the quiet older sister whose accomplishments somehow never seemed worth mentioning. Keeping those worlds apart had become second nature. A few days later, Aunt Patricia sent me a text message. "Looks like we're together at table 9. At least neither of us will be lonely." She added a smiling face at the end. I stared at the message longer than I expected. It wasn't the table that saddened me. It was realizing that my aunt already knew exactly where she belonged, without even questioning it. The rehearsal dinner took place the evening before the wedding at an elegant steakhouse downtown. Ryan's parents welcomed everyone warmly. The atmosphere felt relaxed until Mom began introducing family members. She reached me near the end of the line. "And this is my other daughter, Lauren." She laughed lightly before continuing. "Our career woman, still single. Maybe someone here has an eligible nephew." Several guests laughed politely. Others shifted awkwardly. I smiled because smiling required less energy than explaining why the joke wasn't funny. After dinner, while everyone else lingered over dessert, I stepped outside to enjoy the cool evening air. The city lights reflected across nearby windows. For several peaceful minutes, I simply stood there listening to distant traffic. "Lorraine?" I turned. Ryan's mother, Sandra, walked toward me holding her coat over one arm. "Mind if I join you?" "Of course." We stood together without speaking. Finally, she looked toward the skyline. "I've been watching your family." I felt my shoulders tense. She noticed. "I'm not judging anyone," she said kindly. "I've simply spent enough years working with children to recognize when someone has learned to become invisible." I didn't know what to say. She smiled gently. "For whatever it's worth, building a meaningful life before finding the right person isn't something to apologize for." Her words landed with surprising force. She barely knew me. Yet in 2 sentences, she acknowledged something my own mother had ignored for decades. "Thank you," I whispered. She squeezed my arm. "Never let someone else's definition of success become your own." After she walked back inside, I remained alone for several more minutes. The breeze had turned colder. So had the realization settling quietly inside me. Sometimes complete strangers offer more understanding than the people who have known you your entire life. That night, I drove back to my mother's house, where I was staying for the wedding weekend. My childhood bedroom looked almost exactly as I had left it years earlier. The faded wallpaper remained. The old bookshelf still stood beside the window. Even the glow-in-the-dark stars my father had placed on the ceiling when I was 8 continued clinging stubbornly above the bed, though only a few still held enough light to shine. I lay there staring upward, wondering how one room could preserve so many memories while making me feel like I no longer belonged inside it. Just as I closed my eyes, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. The screen displayed David Harrington's name. I had no idea that answering that message would quietly begin the most important 24 hours of my life. I answered the message almost immediately, expecting another update about an upcoming board meeting or a client issue that couldn't wait until Monday. Instead, I found myself reading the same words 3 times before they truly registered. David wrote that the board had voted unanimously that afternoon to appoint me as the company's next chief operating officer. The promotion would become official on Monday morning after I signed the appointment documents. He added that he was spending the weekend at the company's leadership retreat near Lake Geneva and wanted to deliver the paperwork personally. His final sentence was simple. "Congratulations. You earned this years ago." For several minutes I simply stared at the screen. The title represented more than a promotion. It was the position I had quietly worked toward for nearly a decade, sacrificing weekends, holidays, relationships, and countless hours of sleep. I thought about every difficult decision, every international flight, every crisis that had seemed impossible until my team found a solution. Somehow, all of those years had led to this single message arriving while I lay in the same bedroom where I had once believed I would never be enough. I finally replied, "I'm at the Langham, for my sister's wedding tomorrow." His answer arrived less than a minute later. "I'll drive down tomorrow evening. Some moments deserve to happen face to face." I smiled despite myself. That was exactly the kind of thing David would say. He understood that leadership wasn't built only through strategy or financial performance. Sometimes it was built through showing people they mattered. I placed my phone on the nightstand and looked up at the faint glow of the stars my father had attached to the ceiling decades earlier. "I wish you were here, Dad," I whispered into the quiet room. Sleep came in short stretches. Every time I woke, my mind drifted back to the message. Chief Operating Officer. Even after repeating the words silently, they still felt unreal. The next morning, I left the house early and checked into my hotel room before the bridal preparations began. The contrast between my room and the bridal suite perfectly reflected my place in the wedding. Upstairs, Chloe laughed with her bridesmaids, while makeup artists, photographers, and hairstylists moved in every direction. Family members came and went carrying flowers, dresses, and champagne. Down the hall on another floor, I unpacked my own suitcase in complete silence. No one had intentionally excluded me from the bridal party, at least not officially. Chloe had explained weeks earlier that Ryan only had 4 groomsmen, so she wanted 4 bridesmaids to keep everything symmetrical. I accepted the explanation because arguing would have accomplished nothing. Still, standing alone while fastening my own earrings, I couldn't ignore the familiar feeling of watching life happen just outside the room where I happened to be standing. I showered slowly and took my time getting ready. The navy dress hanging in the closet had cost less than $100, but it fit perfectly. I had learned long ago that elegance came from confidence rather than price tags. The last thing I put on was my father's old Timex watch. The leather strap had begun cracking around the edges years earlier. Friends had offered to buy me a replacement. I always declined. Some things become more valuable because of their imperfections. Just before leaving my room, my phone buzzed again. "David, I'm on the road. Should reach the hotel around 7:30 tonight. Don't let anyone rush you. We'll celebrate properly." I slipped the phone into my clutch. For a brief moment, I considered telling him to wait until Monday. The wedding belonged to Chloe. The attention should remain on her. Signing executive paperwork in a hotel lobby afterward seemed much more appropriate. That was the familiar instinct. Stay quiet. Stay out of the way. Keep the two halves of my life separate. I pushed the thought aside and headed downstairs. The ceremony took place on the hotel's outdoor terrace beneath brilliant October sunlight. The weather couldn't have been more beautiful. Golden leaves shimmered gently in the breeze, while guests admired the skyline beyond the gardens. I watched Chloe walk toward Ryan, wearing a radiant smile that made every guest stand. She truly looked happy. Watching them exchange vows filled me with genuine affection. Despite everything between our mother and me, I wanted my sister's marriage to begin with joy. Ryan looked at her with unmistakable devotion. For the first time all weekend, nothing felt complicated. Aunt Patricia sat beside me during the ceremony. She quietly squeezed my hand once, as Chloe said, "I do." I returned the gesture. Neither of us needed words. After the ceremony ended, guests moved inside for cocktails while the ballroom was prepared for dinner. I excused myself and walked toward the lobby. I didn't need food. I didn't need another conversation. I needed a few uninterrupted minutes alone. The women's restroom near the lobby was empty. Soft lighting reflected across polished marble walls and oversized mirrors. I stepped inside, locked the door behind me, and rested both hands against the counter. For the first time that day, I looked directly at my own reflection, instead of simply checking my appearance. The woman staring back at me looked composed. Professional. Capable. No one seeing her would guess she had spent most of her life believing she occupied second place before the competition even began. I thought about the message waiting inside my phone. I thought about the board members who had trusted me with one of the largest leadership roles in the company. Thousands of employees would soon look to me for direction. Yet, in less than an hour, I would be eating dinner at table 9 beside the service entrance because my own family considered me an afterthought. The contrast suddenly became impossible to ignore. For years I had blamed my mother's behavior for the distance between us. Standing there, another truth quietly surfaced. She wasn't the only reason I had remained invisible. I had become an active participant. Every promotion I concealed, every achievement I minimized, every compliment I brushed aside, every opportunity to let people truly know me. I had convinced myself that silence protected me. Instead, silence had become another prison. A memory returned unexpectedly. Aunt Patricia, sitting beside me years earlier, with a mug of hot chocolate. I became so good at disappearing that eventually I couldn't find myself anymore. This time, I finally understood. I wasn't looking at the frightened teenager who had overheard her mother dismiss her future. I wasn't looking at the uncertain graduate hoping one more accomplishment might finally earn approval. I was looking at a woman who had built an extraordinary life while continuing to ask permission to occupy space inside her own family. My mother was never going to wake up one morning and suddenly become someone different. No promotion could change that. No amount of success could rewrite 40 years of habits. The only person capable of changing the story was me. I slowly straightened my shoulders. The movement was almost invisible. No dramatic transformation. No speech. Just one quiet decision. I would stop shrinking myself to make other people comfortable. Whatever happened during the reception, I would no longer pretend to be less than I was. I washed my hands, dried them carefully, and opened the restroom door. Aunt Patricia stood waiting just outside, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. She studied my face for several seconds. "You look different," she said softly. I accepted one of the glasses and smiled. "I think I finally am." She nodded as though she understood far more than I had actually said. Together, we walked toward the ballroom. The reception was about to begin, and although I didn't know exactly how the evening would unfold, I carried something back into that room I had never brought to any family gathering before. I carried the quiet certainty that I no longer needed anyone else's permission to be seen. I carried that quiet certainty with me as Aunt Patricia, and I stepped into the ballroom, but nothing around us had changed. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead. Waiters moved gracefully between the tables, and soft music floated through the room while guests found their seats. The place card still directed me to table 9, tucked near the service entrance exactly where my mother had intended. Surprisingly, I no longer felt insulted by the location. For years, I had believed the table defined my place in the family. Now I understood that it reflected only my mother's opinion, not my value. Patricia settled into the chair beside mine and smiled gently. "You seem peaceful." I think I finally stopped waiting. Waiting for what? For someone else to decide I matter. She looked at me for a long moment before quietly reaching across the table and squeezing my hand. "I'm glad you figured that out sooner than I did." The conversation faded as dinner began. Servers carried elegant plates through the ballroom while guests laughed over cocktails and exchanged stories. Ryan's relatives chatted comfortably with one another. Friends from Chloe's college reminisced about old memories. From where I sat, I could see the head table clearly. Chloe looked radiant beside her new husband, completely absorbed in the happiness of the evening. I wanted that happiness for her. Whatever happened between our mother and me had never been Chloe's burden to carry, even if she had unknowingly benefited from it. As the first course was served, my phone vibrated silently inside my clutch. "David." I slipped the phone beneath the table and glanced at the message. "I'm about 20 minutes away. Looking forward to seeing you." I smiled before locking the screen. Patricia noticed. "Good news?" "Very." She didn't ask another question. She had always possessed the rare ability to recognize when silence deserved respect. While guests enjoyed dinner, I found myself observing the room instead of participating in the conversations around me. It struck me how many years I had spent worrying about what everyone thought of me. Yet that evening, most people weren't paying attention to me at all. They were celebrating a wedding, sharing stories, laughing with friends, living inside their own moments. Fear has an unusual way of convincing us we're standing at the center of everyone's attention. The truth is that most people are simply living their own lives. That realization felt strangely liberating. After dinner plates were cleared away, the lights dimmed slightly as the DJ welcomed everyone to the speeches. Ryan's college roommate spoke first. His toast was warm, funny, and full of embarrassing stories that had the entire ballroom laughing. Next came Chloe's maid of honor, who spoke about friendship, loyalty, and watching two wonderful people find one another. By the time she finished, more than a few guests were wiping tears from their eyes. I applauded sincerely. Everything about those speeches reflected exactly what a wedding should feel like. Then my mother stood. She didn't wait to be introduced. She simply walked toward the microphone with the confidence of someone who believed every room naturally belonged to her. The applause grew polite as she reached the center of the ballroom. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief before speaking. "Since my husband can't be here tonight, I'd like to say a few words on behalf of both of us." The sentence immediately tightened something inside me. My father would never have delivered the speech I suspected was coming. He would have celebrated Chloe and quietly returned to his seat. He never needed another person to become smaller in order for someone else to shine. Mom began exactly as everyone expected. She shared childhood stories about Chloe. She described dance recitals, birthday parties, family vacations, and the joy of watching her youngest daughter grow into a beautiful woman. Guests smiled warmly. Laughter filled the room several times. She knew exactly how to hold an audience. Then I noticed the shift. Her eyes found me. I recognized that expression instantly. I had seen it across dinner tables, birthdays, graduations, and countless holidays. Whenever attention alone stopped being enough, she instinctively searched for someone to stand beneath her spotlight. Tonight, that someone was me. And of course, she continued brightly, I have another daughter. Several guests turned toward my table. Lauren has always been the smart one. She paused. I knew that pause. It wasn't hesitation. It was timing. She wanted the room to lean forward. Then came the smile. The same smile I had watched my entire childhood. I suppose God gives every family balance. A few scattered laughs drifted through the ballroom. She continued. One daughter found love early. Another pause. The other. She tilted her head dramatically. Well, let's all pray for her. She's turning 40 and somehow still hasn't convinced a single man to marry her. The words landed exactly the way she intended. Gasps. Nervous laughter. Then louder laughter as more people decided it must be acceptable because the bride's mother was smiling. I heard forks resting against china. Someone coughed awkwardly. Across the room, a woman covered her mouth in visible discomfort, while another guest laughed harder than anyone else. I remained completely still. Oddly enough, I didn't feel embarrassed. The bathroom mirror had already done its work. The woman sitting at table 9 no longer measured herself by the opinions floating around that ballroom. Mom wasn't finished. I honestly wonder where I went wrong. More laughter. But perhaps divine intervention still has a chance. She smiled proudly, as though she had just delivered the evening's funniest joke. I looked down at my sparkling water. Tiny bubbles continued drifting toward the surface, completely undisturbed by the noise surrounding them. Something about that image calmed me. The room could erupt around them. They still rose exactly as they were created to do. Patricia's hand rested lightly near mine beneath the table. She didn't touch me this time. She simply left it there in case I wanted the comfort. I appreciated the gesture more than she probably realized. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated again. Without urgency, I slipped it from my clutch and glanced down. David's message contained only 6 words. I'm pulling into the hotel now. I stared at the screen for several seconds. The familiar version of me immediately suggested the safest solution. Meet him quietly in the lobby. Sign the documents. Return before anyone noticed. Protect everyone from discomfort. protect myself from attention. The old habits were remarkably persistent. Then I slowly lifted my eyes. Across the ballroom stood my mother, smiling confidently beneath the lights, while 200 guests believed they had just witnessed an amusing family joke. Beside me sat Aunt Patricia, her shoulders slightly curved from a lifetime of making herself smaller. I suddenly realized what would happen if I chose silence one more time. Nothing. Tomorrow everyone would remember me, exactly as my mother had described me. The invisible older sister. The lonely career woman. The disappointment. Not because her story was true, because I had continued allowing it to become the only story anyone ever heard. I looked down at my phone once more. This time my fingers didn't hesitate. I opened the conversation with David and typed a single word. Ballroom. I pressed send. Then I quietly placed my phone back inside my clutch, lifted my eyes toward the front of the room, and slowly rose to my feet. I slowly rose to my feet. The movement itself wasn't dramatic, yet it immediately changed the atmosphere inside the ballroom. Conversations stopped one by one. My mother's smile hesitated for the first time that evening as she watched me stand beside table 9. She had expected silence because silence had always been my role. Instead, every pair of eyes gradually turned toward me, waiting to see whether I would laugh along with the joke or quietly accept another public humiliation. I rested one hand lightly against the back of my chair. My heart was beating faster than usual, but years of leading difficult negotiations had taught me something valuable. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else matters more. I looked directly at my mother. She still held the microphone with complete confidence. Her expression suggested she believed I was about to offer a polite response, perhaps even make another self-deprecating joke that would allow everyone to relax. Instead, I spoke calmly. Actually, Mom. My voice carried farther than I expected. Not because I raised it. Because the ballroom had become completely silent. I don't think anyone here needs to pray for me. A few guests exchanged uncertain glances. My mother laughed softly. Oh, sweetheart, I'm only teasing. For most of my life, those 4 words had erased everything. Every insult became humor. Every cruel remark became a misunderstanding. Every wound became evidence that I simply lacked a sense of humor. This time, they changed nothing. I smiled politely. I know you believe that. She shifted her weight slightly. The confidence remained on her face, but something underneath it had begun to crack. She was no longer controlling the conversation. She tried to recover. We all know you work very hard. Several people nodded awkwardly. I've always admired your dedication. The sentence sounded strange coming from her. Not because it was kind, because it wasn't true. She had never admired my dedication. She had merely learned that kindness sounded better in front of an audience. I didn't challenge her. I didn't need to. Instead, I glanced briefly toward the ballroom entrance before looking back at her. There's just one thing. She blinked. What is it? You said no one wanted me. The room remained perfectly still. I continued in the same measured tone. That's not entirely accurate. She laughed again, though this time it sounded forced. Oh? I nodded once. He's already here. The words had barely left my mouth when the large ballroom doors opened behind the last row of guests. Every head turned simultaneously. The room fell into a silence so complete that I could hear the soft click of polished dress shoes against the marble floor outside. David Harrington stepped through the entrance, carrying a dark leather portfolio beneath one arm. He wasn't trying to make an entrance. He simply walked with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to entering important rooms without needing permission. Several guests instinctively moved aside to let him pass. Others simply stared, unsure whether he belonged to the wedding or had accidentally entered the wrong ballroom. David scanned the room only once. The moment he saw me, he smiled warmly and walked directly toward table 9. He didn't stop to greet anyone else. He didn't hesitate. He didn't glance toward the head table. His destination had been decided long before he entered the room. As he approached, I noticed confusion spreading across my mother's face. At first, curiosity, then cautious optimism. A well-dressed man walking toward her unmarried daughter seemed to fit the story she had already begun creating in her mind. Perhaps, she thought, this was a boyfriend nobody knew about. Perhaps the evening could still become another story centered around her. David reached my table. Without a trace of awkwardness, he extended his hand. "Sorry I'm a little late, Lauren." I shook it. "You made excellent time." He smiled. I wasn't about to let a moment like this wait until Monday. He placed the leather portfolio carefully on the table before opening it. The sound of the metal clasp echoed softly through the silent ballroom. Guests leaned forward in their chairs. Several people stood to get a better view. David removed a neatly prepared document and laid it before me. Then he produced a fountain pen. He looked directly into my eyes. The board of directors voted unanimously. His voice remained calm, professional, and unmistakably clear. "Beginning Monday morning, you officially become the Chief Operating Officer of Archer and Weston." A ripple of confusion swept through the room. Most guests didn't immediately understand what they had just heard. Some recognized the company name. Others simply sensed that something significant was unfolding. David continued. "This promotion reflects years of extraordinary leadership, integrity, and results. Frankly, Lauren, the only mistake the board believes it made was waiting this long." I heard someone whisper behind me, "Chief Operating Officer?" Another guest quietly repeated the name of the company. Then everything changed. Ryan's father slowly stood from his seat. Richard Prescott had spent decades building a successful commercial real estate business. Unlike most people in the room, he immediately recognized exactly who was standing before him. He stared at David with unmistakable surprise. "Excuse me." David turned politely. "Yes? Are you David Harrington?" "I am." Richard looked from David to me, then back again. "My goodness." He shook his head in disbelief. "You mean Lauren is the new Chief Operating Officer of Archer and Weston?" David answered without hesitation. "She is." He smiled proudly. "And she's also one of the finest executives I've ever had the privilege of working with." The silence shattered. Whispers spread across every table. Phones quietly appeared beneath tablecloths as people searched the company's name. Expressions changed almost instantly. The woman who had been introduced only minutes earlier as the lonely older sister suddenly became someone entirely different. Not because I had changed, because the truth had finally entered the room. I looked around the ballroom. Guests who had laughed moments earlier now avoided my eyes. Others watched me with obvious admiration. A few appeared embarrassed. Uncle Gary rose first. Without saying a word, he began applauding. The sound echoed alone for only a second before others slowly joined him. Soon applause filled the ballroom. It wasn't loud, because people felt obligated. It was steady because they were witnessing a story they suddenly realized they had misunderstood from the beginning. Beside me, Aunt Patricia covered her mouth with trembling hands. Tears streamed down her face. For once, they weren't tears of helplessness. They were tears of relief. Relief that someone she loved had finally been seen exactly as she truly was. I turned toward my mother. She hadn't moved. The microphone still hung loosely in her hand. For the first time in my entire life, she looked completely unsure of what came next. For the first time in my entire life, she looked completely unsure of what came next. The woman who had always controlled every family gathering, every conversation, every carefully crafted narrative, suddenly found herself standing in front of 200 people without a script. I could almost see the calculations racing through her mind as she searched for a way to regain control of the room. She forced a smile. "Oh, Lauren," she said into the microphone, her voice noticeably thinner than before. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" There it was. Not an apology. Not concern. Not even surprise. Her first instinct was to reposition herself inside the story, to make it seem as though my success had simply been a family secret waiting to be shared. I met her eyes calmly. "I tried." She blinked. "I don't understand. I told you about promotions. I told you when I bought my condo. I told you when I received leadership awards." The ballroom remained silent. "You just weren't interested." No one laughed. No one moved. The words weren't spoken with anger. They didn't need to be. Truth has a way of filling a room all by itself. My mother looked around as if searching for someone to interrupt the conversation. No one did. She took a slow step toward me. "I've always been proud of you." The sentence floated through the ballroom without finding a place to land. Even she didn't sound convinced. I thought about every report card she had ignored, every achievement she had reduced to a joke, every milestone that somehow became another reminder that I wasn't living according to her definition of success. For years I had imagined hearing those words. Now that they finally came, they felt strangely empty. Before I could answer, David spoke. "Mrs. Mitchell." His tone remained respectful, but there was unmistakable authority behind it. "I've worked with your daughter for many years." Mom turned toward him with visible relief, almost grateful that someone else had entered the conversation. "I'm sure you know how remarkable she is." "I do." David nodded. "In fact, that's exactly why our board selected her unanimously." He paused briefly. "I've led this company long enough to recognize extraordinary leadership when I see it. Lauren consistently puts other people before herself, accepts responsibility when things go wrong, and gives credit away when things go right. Those qualities are exceptionally rare." Several guests nodded quietly. David continued. "Many executives achieve impressive financial results." He looked toward me. "Very few earn the level of trust that she has." I felt unexpectedly emotional, hearing someone describe me so openly. Not because of the promotion. Because someone was speaking about my character instead of my accomplishments. My father would have appreciated that. Mom smiled weakly. "Well, she certainly learned responsibility growing up." The sentence immediately reminded me of something she had always done. Whenever praise became unavoidable, she quietly reached for partial ownership. I answered before David could. "No." My voice remained gentle. "I learned responsibility because Dad showed me what it looked like." The room became silent again. Mentioning my father shifted the atmosphere in an entirely different way. People remembered him. His kindness. His quiet nature. His habit of encouraging everyone around him without asking for recognition. Mom's expression faltered. For the first time that evening, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. She lowered the microphone slightly. "I miss him every day." "So do I." I smiled sadly. "But he never would have stood where you're standing tonight." Those words carried more weight than I expected. Not because they attacked her, because everyone in the room knew they were true. Ryan looked toward the floor. Sandra Prescott quietly reached for her husband's hand. Even Chloe stared at her wedding bouquet without lifting her head. The silence stretched until something unexpected happened. The microphone slipped from my mother's hand. It struck the polished floor with a sharp echo that bounced through the ballroom before rolling to a stop near the edge of the dance floor. Nobody rushed to pick it up. For years, that microphone had symbolized complete control. Now it rested on the floor between us, ignored by everyone. One of the hotel servers approached carefully. "Mom?" Mom didn't respond. He quietly retrieved the microphone and carried it away without another word. The symbolic weight of that simple moment wasn't lost on anyone. David turned back toward me and gently rotated the leather portfolio. "I believe there's one final detail." He placed the appointment letter directly in front of me. The signature line waited near the bottom. He handed me the fountain pen. "This belongs to you." My father's watch caught the ballroom lights as I accepted it. For a brief second, I rested my hand on the document. I wasn't thinking about the title. I wasn't thinking about the salary or the office waiting for me on Monday morning. I was thinking about the 14-year-old girl standing silently in a hallway with straight A's inside her backpack, believing she would never be enough. I wish she could see this moment. Not because strangers were finally applauding, because she had eventually learned that another person's inability to recognize her worth never diminished that worth in the first place. I signed my name slowly and returned the pen. David extended his hand again. "Congratulations, Chief Operating Officer." This time, the applause came naturally. It spread through the ballroom without hesitation. No one seemed interested in polite etiquette anymore. People stood from their chairs. Some smiled. Others simply watched quietly, understanding they had witnessed something much larger than a corporate promotion. They had watched someone reclaim ownership of her own story. As the applause gradually faded, David closed the portfolio. "I'll let you get back to celebrating your sister's wedding." He leaned closer before speaking quietly enough that only I could hear. "I told you some moments deserve to happen in person." I smiled. "You were right." He nodded once and began walking toward the ballroom entrance. This time, many guests instinctively stepped aside with expressions of respect, not because he was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, but because they now understood why he had come. He hadn't arrived to rescue me. He had arrived to honor work that had already earned recognition. When the doors closed behind him, the ballroom felt different. Nothing about the decorations had changed. The music remained soft. The candles still flickered across every table. Yet the room itself seemed lighter somehow, as though a truth that had been waiting outside for decades had finally been invited inside. I looked toward my mother one last time. She remained standing near the front of the ballroom, surrounded by guests yet completely alone. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel anger when I looked at her. I felt something far quieter. I felt free. I felt free. It was such a simple emotion, yet it was unlike anything I had experienced before. For 40 years I had measured family gatherings by how carefully I could avoid becoming a target. That night, for the first time, I wasn't calculating my words, lowering my achievements, or wondering whether I had somehow done something wrong. I simply stood where I was, surrounded by people who were beginning to see me as I had always been. The reception slowly found its rhythm again. Music returned. Conversations cautiously resumed. Guests drifted back toward their tables, although many of them no longer stayed there for very long. Instead, they began walking toward table 9. Ona. A second cousin I barely remembered introduced himself and admitted he had no idea what I actually did for a living. One of Ryan's business school friends asked thoughtful questions about leadership instead of making assumptions about my personal life. Several relatives who had spent years exchanging little more than holiday greetings suddenly wanted to know about my work, my travels, and the company I had helped build. Their curiosity didn't make me feel triumphant. If anything, it made me realize how little anyone had ever asked before. One man smiled awkwardly and said, "Why didn't you ever tell us all of this?" I answered honestly. "I thought the people who loved me would want to know before I had to explain." He lowered his eyes. "I suppose that's fair." There was no bitterness in my voice. The evening had moved beyond blame. I wasn't interested in making anyone feel guilty. I had spent enough years carrying emotions that belonged to other people. Near the dessert table, Ryan approached me while guests gathered around the wedding cake. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "For what?" "I've only known your family a short time, and even I should have recognized what was happening." I shook my head. "You weren't responsible for it." "No," he admitted, "but I still wish I had spoken up earlier." I smiled. "The important thing is that you'll never let something like that happen in your own family." He looked toward Chloe, who was laughing politely with a group of guests while occasionally glancing in my direction. "I won't." "I know." He extended his hand. Instead, I hugged him. He had always treated me with kindness, even when he didn't fully understand the family he was marrying into. That counted for something. A little later, Chloe found me standing near one of the ballroom windows overlooking the Chicago River. Her wedding gown shimmered softly beneath the lights, but the confidence she had carried all day had been replaced by uncertainty. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, she took a slow breath. "I've been thinking." I waited. "I always knew Mom favored me." Her voice was almost a whisper. "I just never realized how much it cost you." Those words reached a place inside me that years of apologies never could have. Not because they erased the past, because they acknowledged it. "I don't blame you," I said. "You were a child." She looked down at her hands. "I wasn't a child forever." "No. I should have noticed." I smiled gently. "Maybe." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I don't know how to fix this." I thought about that for a moment before answering. "You don't fix 40 years in one conversation." She nodded slowly. "So, where do we start?" "With honesty." She looked at me. Then here's the truth. She took another deep breath. I admired you my whole life. I couldn't hide my surprise. She laughed softly through her tears. I know that sounds ridiculous. It does. She smiled. You always seemed so calm, so capable. Every time something difficult happened, you somehow figured it out. She wiped her eyes. I thought you didn't need anyone. I reached for her hand. I needed people. I smiled sadly. I just stopped expecting them. She squeezed my fingers. I'd like to do better. I'd like that too. We stood together for another minute before Ryan called her back for another dance. As she walked away, I realized something important. Healing doesn't begin when someone says exactly the right words. It begins when two people finally stop pretending. Later that evening, I found Aunt Patricia collecting her coat near the entrance. She looked different. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. Her shoulders seemed straighter. Her smile reached her eyes in a way I had never seen before. She held both of my hands. You gave me something tonight. I shook my head. No, you did. Her voice trembled. I spent decades believing it was too late for me to become the person I wanted to be. She laughed quietly. And now, I'm wondering if that's just another story. I accepted without questioning. I smiled. What are you going to do? She surprised both of us with her answer. I'm thinking about taking classes at the community college. I laughed happily. You'd be wonderful. I'll probably be the oldest student. So? She grinned. So maybe that's exactly why I should go. I hugged her tightly. For years I had believed I was the only one trapped inside my mother's version of the world. Standing there with Patricia, I realized freedom has a way of spreading quietly from one life into another. Eventually the reception came to an end. Guests collected gifts and coats, while hotel staff began clearing tables. I slipped outside into the cool October night, carrying nothing except my purse and my father's watch on my wrist. The city lights reflected across the river as I walked toward the parking garage. My modest Honda waited exactly where I had left it. I sat behind the steering wheel for several minutes before starting the engine. The silence inside the car felt peaceful instead of lonely. I looked at my watch. Then I smiled toward the windshield. I finally stopped disappearing. Dad. The words felt lighter once they were spoken aloud. On Monday morning, I walked into Archer and Weston as its new chief operating officer. My mother's calls went unanswered for a while, not because I hated her, but because peace sometimes requires distance before it allows forgiveness. A few weeks later, Chloe invited me to lunch. We talked for hours. There was no miracle, no perfect ending. Only two sisters choosing, for the first time, to build an honest relationship instead of inheriting an unhealthy one. Aunt Patricia enrolled in her first college course before the end of the month. She sent me a photograph of her student identification card with the biggest smile I had ever seen on her face. I framed that picture beside the old photograph of my father at my college graduation. One reminded me where I came from. The other reminded me that it is never too late to become who you were always meant to be. If there's one lesson my journey taught me, it's this. Never let someone else's limited view of your worth become the foundation of your identity. The table they assign you cannot determine your value. The labels they repeat cannot define your future. The moment you stop asking permission to be seen is the moment your life truly begins. And sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't making the people who underestimated you suffer. It's building a life so full of purpose, dignity, and self-respect that their opinion no longer has the power to matter. Before we say goodbye, I want to leave you with one thought that stayed with me long after this story ended. Sometimes the deepest wounds don't come from strangers. They come from the people whose love we never thought we would have to earn. If you've ever been overlooked, compared, or made to feel like you were never enough, I hope this story reminds you that another person's opinion is never the measure of your worth. You do not need to shrink yourself to keep someone else comfortable, and you do not have to spend your life chasing approval from people who have already decided not to see you. Instead, invest your energy in becoming the person you can be proud of when you look in the mirror. Build your character, your skills, your kindness, and your confidence, Celebrate your victories even when no one applauds, because real success is not about proving someone wrong. It is about refusing to let bitterness define your future. At the same time, if you are a parent, a sibling, or someone who influences another person's life, never underestimate the power of your words. Encouragement can shape a lifetime, but so can constant criticism. Choose to lift people up instead of comparing them. Choose to listen before judging. Most importantly, never wait until someone succeeds to recognize their value. Thank you for spending your time with me today. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone you know, I hope you'll carry its message with you, because everyone deserves to be seen, respected, and loved for who they truly are, not for the role someone else assigned them.